Thank you very much, Norm Ornstein, for joining us on Objections. Very recently, of course, the Senate GOP killed the idea of a independent January 6th commission. So wanted to start things off by just, if you could give us a broad overview, what are the alternatives before going to the ones that you would like to see happen?
Sure. So, just a little bit of the backdrop here, of course, is that they struggled in the House of Representatives to figure out what kind of a commission they could do that would be bipartisan. Every time we've had commissions in the past, if you go back to the Kerner Commission set up by a presidential decree, an executive order by Lyndon Johnson to investigate the assassination of John F. Kennedy, all the way through things like the 9/11 Commission, they've been bipartisan and evenly divided. It was tricky this time, and obviously tricky because 2/3 of the House Republicans, after the violent assault and insurrection at the Capitol, where many of them were in danger, still voted that the election had been illegitimate. So how do you strike that balance? And the Speaker basically delegated to the chair of the Homeland Security Committee, Benny Thompson, and the minority leader, Kevin McCarthy, to the ranking member to work something out. And Democrats made a lot of concessions here. The key thing to remember, Adam, with a commission of this sort is you have to have subpoena power. You have to be able to require witnesses to appear in front of you. You have to be able to have some ability to get not just documents, but in this case, what we know is absolutely critical, which is phone records, text messages, emails that went back and forth among and between the violent groups and gangs, not only among and between groups like the Proud Boys, but also with members of Congress, with the administration, with the president himself. We know, among other things, that the Defense Department deliberately delayed, after denying the ability for the National Guard to go and help out the overmanned and under-resourced Capitol Police and District of Columbia Police. So for all of those things, Democrats agreed, first of all, to have an evenly divided commission, not to have a Democratic Party majority, to make sure that no existing members of Congress were on it, and most significantly, to say that subpoenas could only be issued if the chair and ranking member, the co-chairs, agreed, or in the absence of that, if a majority of the commission agreed, which would mean you'd need at least one Republican. Those were all the demands of Kevin McCarthy. And after those demands were met, McCarthy turned thumbs down. Right. Now, even with that, 35 House Republicans voted for it. And then, of course, Mitch McConnell stepped in and said no. So a commission done through a resolution of Congress passed in both houses was not going to happen. It didn't happen. It was blocked by the filibuster in the Senate. One alternative, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, can call for and request a vote in the House to create a select committee, a House committee, that she could set up if she wanted with only Democrats or with a supermajority of Democrats. And at least in theory, she could pick the Republicans, if there were going to be any on the committee, who were from this small group who voted to impeach Donald Trump over this insurrection, or who voted for the creation of this commission. That's not a great alternative. The other two alternatives are a presidentially created commission done through executive action, as happened with the Kerner Commission, or something done through the Justice Department that could use the regulations built around a special counsel, the same regulations that gave us Robert Mueller, but with a lot of variations and some creativity.
So right now we have three buckets here. We have the select committee, by the Speaker of the House. We have the possibility of a Kerner type commission from executive order by the president, and the DOJ route. Let's just start with the Speaker Pelosi route. How would, assuming Speaker Pelosi created a select committee on this, how would that differ from what the January 6th commission could have been? Could such a commission be created that it would essentially be the same form and structure?
It would not have the same form and structure. The kind of commission created by a joint resolution would have, first of all, had a different imprimatur. It would have had both parties saying, this was an unprecedented act, and we need to get to the bottom of who was behind it, who supported it, who surreptitiously tried to make it work to overturn the results of the election. A select committee is going to be a partisan act, even if it has a small number of Republicans. It's going to have the House and not the Senate. But also, a resolution of this sort would mean that you could work, of the sort that failed on the filibuster, could work in concert with the executive branch to be able to get more power, more subpoena power, at least potentially so. Now, the other aspect of it is that if it had gone through, it likely would have gotten an enormous amount of public attention. And in the end, I think you could look at what Mitch McConnell did, believing that, yes, Republicans that he and Kevin McCarthy would have picked could block subpoenas, but it would all be done in public hearings, and the questions would be raised at a level that we would not see otherwise. Why do you not want this person or that person to testify? Why are you blocking access to the texts or emails that they might have sent back and forth with the leaders on the ground in the insurrection? So a select committee is going to be immediately portrayed, not just by Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell, but by Fox News and all the other megaphones that they have, as a purely partisan witch hunt, in the same way that Donald Trump has called almost everything that looks at him a witch hunt. They wouldn't cover it in the same way, and more than likely it wouldn't get the same kind of television coverage that it would under other circumstances. Now, the other big difference, and this is the critical difference, is a select committee is only going to have congressional subpoena authority. Now, in theory, the congressional subpoena is a very powerful one. If people don't comply with a congressional subpoena, they can be held in contempt by a vote of Congress. A vote of the House could do it. Now, in theory, what's called inherent contempt, the House could then, if somebody continued to defy, send out the sergeant at arms and arrest the recalcitrant and put him or her in the equivalent of a jail inside the Capitol. Of course, that's not realistic. It doesn't happen. And so what we know from history is, and especially during the Trump years, but even before, people defy congressional subpoenas, knowing that they're pretty much toothless. And they can go to court. And this gets dragged out in the courts, often for a very long period of time. Now, of course, the other thing that can happen is you can comply with the subpoena and basically plead the Fifth Amendment to every question asked. And then you're left without much anyhow. Frankly, it's going to be less the testimony, although that some of that could be very, very powerful in a public setting, but more the evidentiary record. Let's just say, we don't know this for a fact, it may not be there, but let's just say that the 3 Republican House members, including Paul Gosar of Arizona and Mo Brooks of Alabama, who one of the leaders of the insurrection said had worked with them to plan it, had emails going back and forth, not just with the planner, but with President Trump, saying, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we'd like you to say. We want you to incite them. What if we know that there are emails or text messages with Marjorie Taylor Greene and some of the people who were brought in the days leading up to the insurrection for Capitol tours. And we know that in some of those tours that the rioters were led to in the labyrinth of the Capitol. Over 50 years, I've been in the Capitol thousands of times, and it's easy to get lost. Many of the doors are unmarked. There are private offices, hideaway offices for leaders and others. We know that some of these insurrectionists went right to the unmarked offices of some of the leaders. Somebody told them where they were. They're not going to testify to that, but we might get it in the record. And it's not likely that Congress is going to be able to find that out without having a much more robust subpoena power.
And why wouldn't a executive option, the President Biden, by executive order, creating a Kerner type commission, how would that fall short of that goal?
So I at one level, it would be terrific because you could do it as a president and you could designate the members. And frankly, you could pick an equal number of Democrats and Republicans if the Republicans you pick are, say, people like Tom Ridge, the former governor of Pennsylvania, Homeland Security Secretary, a man of impeccable credentials. Fran Townsend, who did Homeland Security inside the Bush White House. Michael Chertoff. There are many, many Republicans that could be picked. So why not? The downside to this is the insurrection was designed to overthrow the Biden election. So it's the president of the United States setting up a commission to investigate those who were out to get him. And the problem with that is there's a conflict of interest involved. Now, I don't think it is, from my perspective, it's perfectly appropriate. But again, it's much too easy to take something done directly by Joe Biden, aimed at his predecessor and his opponent, and distort it into something illegitimate. So I'd prefer to have one level removed from the president. And that leads us to the third option, which is through the Attorney General, Merrick Garland.
Now, right now, of course, Merrick Garland's investigation into the January 6th attack has produced hundreds of indictments or ongoing investigations. What would be added? What would be changed by, on a parallel track to that, creating a special counsel type vehicle?
Now, it's entirely possible that all of the actions of the Justice Department, these indictments, some of which are going to lead to trials, will uncover a lot of the evidence that we would want to get. But they're not going to get directly, likely, to the members of Congress involved, the acting Secretary of Defense, the other Defense Department officials who we know were put in place weeks before this insurrection with the aim of making sure there were loyalists to Donald Trump who would keep the National Guard from going to the Capitol. What's significant here is that governors around the country have control over their state National Guards. The District of Columbia doesn't operate that way. The mayor of the District of Columbia needs the Defense Department to provide an okay. These were the essential backups to keep the Capitol from being breached by violent rioters aimed at killing the vice president and other members of Congress. And we're not likely to see the Justice Department itself go after these kinds of people, much less people in the White House directly. Now, it may emerge indirectly, but it would be much better if we had a blue ribbon panel with Justice Department subpoena authority aimed at those people who were not the ones breaching the Capitol that day, but the ones creating it and inciting it. And that includes members of Congress, staff, people in the White House, very possibly the president at the time, Donald Trump himself. We are going to need another route to do this. Now, just to circle back for a minute, there's one other issue here, which is when Congress issues subpoenas and brings people in to testify, if we're dealing with criminal conduct, it's often very, very tricky. Congress does not want to get into a position where it interferes with or creates a problem with prosecutions of true miscreants. Often what they will do is offer a kind of qualified immunity that tries to work with the prosecutors to make sure that you don't give immunity to people for acts where they don't deserve it, to skirt around it. It gets very tricky. You do this within the Justice Department itself, it's going to be a little easier to avoid that kind of problem. Now, what I've suggested is we don't just simply create a special counsel as Robert Mueller was. There's ample grounds for doing so. You know, you put a special counsel in place when there is a conflict of interest with those investigating and those being investigated. There is ample reason for that to happen here because obviously there's a conflict of interest. But with the Mueller investigation, it was all done in private until you got the indictments and the court actions themselves. It doesn't have to all be done in private. You can have a special counsel using and listing into the operation top flight prosecutors from the Southern District of New York, from the Public Integrity Section, from the Criminal Section Division of the Justice Department. But I don't see any reason why that special counsel can't at the same time deputize a panel of distinguished Americans to work with him to go through evidence and do some public hearings that will end up not recommending prosecutions necessarily, but recommending new laws and regulations or letting the chips fall where they may to make sure something like this doesn't happen again, but also to help us get to the bottom of it, including pointing out miscreants who may not be easily subject to prosecution, which could be the case with members of Congress. Now, one thing I can tell you is if you have a special committee in the House and that committee tries to subpoena Paul Gosar or Marjorie Taylor Greene or Kevin McCarthy, you're not going to get anywhere. If a special counsel does it, you're into tricky territory, obviously, with the speech and debate clause in Congress. But if you're looking at potential criminal behavior there, you've got leverage to bring them in. And if they refuse those subpoenas, then we're into a very different kind of territory. And it sheds some real light on why they want to avoid speaking about to investigators or others what happened. And remember too, that while in theory, if you're appearing in front of a congressional committee and you lie, you can be subject to perjury charges. That's not quite the same gravity as if you are interviewed by FBI agents or by prosecutors in the Justice Department, and you lie about, say, a conversation that you had with the president that others overheard. That puts you into a different place. So there's more leverage, more power, more legitimacy, I think, if we go this route.
And in normal times, the idea of the DOJ investigating what security officials agree was a domestic terrorist attack on Congress would be just clearly considered nonpartisan. Yet we've had this vote in the Senate where the GOP killed this. Do you think that the DOJ might have some reluctance to go to an option that was shot down by the Senate?
I think both President Biden and the Attorney General and others in the Justice Department really don't want to do this. It gets you into difficult territory. And at the same time, we know that Biden's priorities right now are trying to get through his infrastructure plan and a much broader social and domestic policy plan, at making sure that we get rid of the worst effects of this pandemic as rapidly as we can, and probably at getting some democracy reforms that can protect us from having an election in 2024 overturned not by a violent assault on the Capitol, but by a violent assault on every norm of our democracy by governors and state legislatures. All of those are higher priorities. We also know that President Biden still wants to make it clear to Americans that he's trying to reach out to the other side and be as bipartisan as he can. And this moves us into a different place. So I understand all of that. But at the same time, this is the kind of threat from within that we have never seen in this country, done by the leaders of one of our two major political parties. And it tells you everything, that knowing that this happened and that many of them were themselves endangered, that they've tried to block it, that they've put partisan interests and the next election, something said eloquently by one of their own members, Lisa Murkowski, over protecting our democracy. And I'll tell you, the limiting case here, Adam, was we know that some of these people went into the Capitol with a noose, having set up a gallows outside to kill Mike Pence, the vice president, egged on, by the way, by his own president. Mike Pence's brother, Greg Pence, took over the House seat that Pence himself had occupied before he left to run for governor of Indiana. Greg Pence voted against the creation of a commission to investigate people who tried to kill his brother. This is no longer a normal political party. It is a cult. It's a cult of personality. And that's why, as much as anything, we need to find some way to get to the bottom of all of this and to make sure that those who did it, who abetted it, who encouraged it, who incited it, are held to account.
Thank you very much, Norman Ornstein, for your time and for your analysis. Very much appreciated.
My pleasure.